is seeing historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
When the announcement first hit the news, most people thought it was a joke. Florida, a state already infamous for its wild headlines, was reportedly turning loose thousands of snake-hunting creatures into the same swamps that were already crawling with invasive predators. Comedians had a field day. Late-night hosts made it a punchline. Social media exploded with memes asking if the state had officially run out of good ideas. But behind the laughter was a story far more serious than anyone realized, a last-ditch effort to save an ecosystem that had been quietly dying for decades. To understand why Florida would do something that sounded this absurd, we have to go back to where the real disaster began. The Everglades once stood as one of the most biologically rich wetlands on Earth. Sawgrass prairies stretched for miles, dotted with hardwood hammocks and cypress domes. Wading birds filled the skies, deer moved through the underbrush, and raccoons picked along the water's edge at night. This single ecosystem generates billions of dollars annually through tourism, fishing, and flood protection for South Florida's growing population. It was, for a long time, a rare place where nature still ran on its own terms. That balance began to crack in the early 1990s. A combination of factors, a powerful hurricane that damaged an exotic animal facility, and pet owners releasing Burmese pythons they could no longer manage, allowed a small number of these massive snakes to establish themselves in the wetlands. For years, almost nobody noticed. A python sighting here and there seemed like a curiosity, not a crisis. But pythons are prolific breeders, and the Everglades offered them everything they needed: warmth, cover, and an abundance of prey with no natural predators built to stop them. Populations grew from a handful of escaped snakes into what researchers now estimate could be tens of thousands, if not more, spread across South Florida. Female pythons can produce dozens of eggs in a single clutch, and with no evolutionary reason for local wildlife to fear them, they move through the landscape as an almost invisible force. The consequences were staggering. Multiple studies tracking mammal populations in python-heavy regions of the Everglades documented dramatic collapses: raccoon, opossum, bobcat, and rabbit sightings plummeting compared to areas without pythons. Deer, once common, became increasingly rare in some regions. The snakes weren't just eating their way through the food web, they were unraveling it. And because pythons are so well camouflaged and elusive, the destruction was happening almost entirely out of public view. Florida didn't sit idle. Wildlife agencies opened the door to hunters, contractors, and volunteers willing to wade into the swamp in search of pythons. Public hunting competitions turned into annual media events, drawing participants from across the country eager to bag the biggest snake and claim a cash prize. Every year, the headlines celebrated the numbers: hundreds of pythons removed, a new record broken, a hunter crowned champion. But the celebratory tone masked an uncomfortable truth. Even in the best years, hunters and contractors removed only a small fraction of the estimated population. Wildlife officials brought in professional python tracking teams, deployed detection dogs trained to follow reptile scent trails, tested thermal imaging drones, and even experimented with using scout snakes, males fitted with radio transmitters and released to lead researchers straight to breeding females during mating season. Each method chipped away at the problem, but none came close to solving it. Scientists eventually admitted publicly what many had feared for years: total eradication of the Burmese python from the Everglades was no longer realistic. The species had become too established, too well adapted, and too difficult to track. The best anyone could hope for was to slow the spread and protect specific high-value areas. It was a sobering realization after more than a decade of effort, funding, and technological innovation. With traditional control methods hitting a ceiling, officials and researchers began looking at the problem differently. If pythons couldn't be hunted into submission, maybe the answer wasn't more traps or more manpower, maybe it was restoring something the ecosystem had lost long before the pythons ever arrived. That's when wildlife agencies announced a plan to reintroduce the eastern indigo snake, a large, non-venomous native species, into parts of its historic range in the Florida Panhandle and beyond. The public reaction was immediate mockery. Headlines framed it as fighting snakes with more snakes. Commentators joke that a state already overrun with invasive reptiles had decided the solution was simply more reptiles. Even some wildlife enthusiasts raised an eyebrow, questioning whether officials had lost the plot entirely. What the jokes missed was that the eastern indigo snake wasn't some random substitute, it was one of North America's most capable natural snake hunters, a species that had once ruled the same longleaf pine forests and wetlands of the southeast before nearly disappearing entirely. Unlike the pythons causing so much damage, the indigo snake is native. It evolved alongside the same rodents, amphibians, and reptiles that make up the region's food web, and critically, it has a well-documented reputation for preying on other snakes, including venomous species it appears largely resistant to. The reintroduction effort wasn't some rushed, reactionary experiment cooked up overnight. Conservation groups and wildlife biologists had spent years quietly breeding indigo snakes in captivity, restoring degraded habitat, and preparing populations for release long before the python crisis reached its most alarming levels. What looked to outsiders like a panicked, last-minute gimmick was, in reality, the product of a slow, methodical restoration program, one rooted in patience rather than headlines. To understand why scientists place so much hope in this animal, it helps to know its history. The eastern indigo snake is the longest native snake species in North America, capable of reaching lengths of 8 feet or more. Its scales carry a deep, iridescent blue-black sheen, occasionally set off by a rust-colored throat, giving it an almost regal appearance that earned it nicknames like Emperor of the Forest. Despite its size, the indigo is non-venomous and generally calm around humans. But within its ecosystem, it behaves like an apex predator. It eats an unusually broad diet: rodents, birds, frogs, turtle eggs, and other snakes, venomous or not. It doesn't rely on constriction like many large snakes. Instead, it simply overpowers prey with its jaws and swallows it, seemingly undeterred by struggle or size. Researchers have documented individual indigo snakes consuming venomous rattlesnakes without apparent harm, a trait that sets them apart from nearly every other snake species in the region. At its historic peak, the eastern indigo ranged across a huge swath of the southeastern United States, from Florida up through Georgia and as far west as Mississippi, thriving in longleaf pine forests and sandy scrublands. But habitat destruction from logging and agricultural expansion devastated its range through the 20th century. Add to that decades of collection for the exotic pet trade and the once common practice of gassing gopher tortoise burrows to flush out rattlesnakes for roundups, a practice that killed indigo snakes sheltering in the same burrows, and the species collapsed. By the late 1970s, the eastern indigo snake was listed as federally threatened, its population reduced to isolated pockets, most of them in Florida. Much of the indigo's fate was tied directly to the gopher tortoise, since indigo snakes rely heavily on tortoise burrows for shelter, nesting, and protection from cold weather. Hundreds of other species also depend on these same burrows, making them one of the most ecologically important structures in the southeast. As tortoise populations declined, indigo snakes lost critical habitat right alongside them, deepening their decline in tandem. While the indigo reintroduction program moved forward, something else was happening across Florida that added an unexpected twist to the story. Wildlife cameras and field researchers began documenting native animals successfully preying on Burmese pythons, something almost unheard of in the earlier years of the invasion. Alligators were photographed consuming smaller pythons. Florida panthers were documented engaging with the invasive snakes. And in one particularly striking case, researchers tracking a large adult male python for a scientific study discovered the animal had been killed, apparently by a bobcat far smaller than itself, a discovery wildlife officials called remarkable, since adult pythons had rarely, if ever, been documented falling prey to native predators in the state. These incidents remain rare, and no single event undoes 2 decades of ecological damage. But biologists view them as an encouraging sign that Florida's native wildlife may be slowly adapting to the presence of these invaders, learning to view them as potential prey rather than an unstoppable threat. It's a slow, uneven process, but every documented case adds a small data point suggesting the system isn't entirely powerless against the invasion. Then came a moment that conservationists had been waiting decades to see. In protected longleaf pine habitat in the Florida Panhandle, biologists monitoring a population of released eastern indigo snakes discovered hatchlings that had not been part of any captive breeding program. These snakes had been born entirely in the wild, the offspring of previously released adults, proof that the reintroduced population wasn't just surviving, it was successfully reproducing on its own. For a species that had been absent from parts of its native range for nearly half a century, this was a genuine milestone. It meant the years of habitat restoration, captive breeding, and careful release planning were paying off in the most meaningful way possible, a self-sustaining population beginning to take root. Since then, biologists have continued to track individual snakes from earlier release groups years later, finding many still alive, still moving through restored habitat, and in some cases contributing to a growing, breeding population. Similar reintroduction efforts have expanded into neighboring states, with hundreds of eastern indigo snakes now released across their historic range as part of a broader, coordinated restoration effort. None of this means Florida's python problem is solved. No single native predator, no matter how effective, is going to eliminate a population of invasive snakes that has already spread across thousands of square miles of wetland. What the indigo reintroduction represents is something more modest but arguably more important, a shift away from the idea that this crisis could be solved through brute force alone, toward a strategy built on restoring the ecological relationships that made the Everglades resilient in the first place. Looking back, the irony is hard to miss. The public mocked the release of a native predator while cheering on python hunters chasing bounty prizes, without realizing both approaches were aimed at the same underlying goal, a more balanced Everglades. Hunters focused on direct removal, while biologists focused on rebuilding the natural checks and balances that had been stripped away over decades. Neither strategy alone could fix what had gone wrong, but together, they represent Florida's broader, more patient approach to a problem that has no quick solution. The story of the eastern indigo snake's return is still being written. Its population remains small, its long-term success far from guaranteed, and the python problem it was reintroduced to help address is nowhere close to over. But its early wild-born hatchlings, its documented survival years after release, and its expanding presence across restored habitat all point to something conservationists rarely get to celebrate, a species once nearly lost, quietly finding its way back home. Whether the emperor of the forest can reclaim enough of its old territory to make a lasting difference is a question only time will answer. What's already clear is that the plan everyone laughed at wasn't the reckless gamble it appeared to be, it was a calculated, science-driven attempt to give a broken ecosystem one of its oldest tools back. Researchers now face a new set of questions. Can the indigo population keep expanding without ongoing human intervention? Will restored longleaf pine habitat continue to grow fast enough to support them? And perhaps most importantly, can this model, restoring a lost native predator rather than simply hunting an invasive one, be applied to other ecosystems facing similar crises around the world? Conservation biologists are cautiously optimistic, but they're also realistic. Ecosystem restoration rarely follows a straight line. Setbacks are common, funding for long-term monitoring isn't guaranteed, and climate patterns, land development, and continued python expansion could all complicate the picture in the years ahead. Still, for a project that started as a punchline, the eastern indigo snake's slow return to Florida's wild places has become something rarer than a quick fix, a genuine sign that patient, evidence-based conservation can still produce real results, even against odds that once seemed impossible. For now, biologists continue their fieldwork the same way they have for years, checking burrows, tracking tagged individuals, and waiting for the next generation of hatchlings to prove that the emperor of the forest is, once again, at home in the land it nearly lost forever.